First off, I want to thank the brave men and women who work behind the wall. I want to thank them on a national level because their job goes unrecognized.
How do they try to turn a guard?
Well, correctional officer. Sorry, I apologize. But correctional officer.
How are you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, very interesting discussion. Very interesting discussion. We are going to be talking about some tips when responding to inmates fighting, whether it's two or more, whether it's in a dorm, a pod, in a cell. And I have two great guests to share in this discussion to provide some tips. I have the founder of Keepers of Chaos, a very popular Facebook group for the correctional officer community, and that's Chaos, K-A-O-S. And we have Russ Hamilton. What's up, Russ?
Hey, Anthony, it's great to be here. Looking forward to discussing this topic. Looking forward to pitching a little bit for Keepers of Chaos. Any corrections professional can join. It's on Facebook, Chaos with a K. And, it's something that we just really try and strive to, promote and represent corrections professional all across the globe.
And that's Chaos with a K and no H. Let's not forget about that, Russ. And we also have, I believe this is his third show. It's always a pleasure to have him, Dr. John Lawrie. What's up, Doc?
Hey, Anthony. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me back. This is my third show. I am Dr. J. Lawrie. I am the chair of the Criminal Justice Department at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, Connecticut. I've been there for about 8 years, and prior to that, I retired from a career with the Connecticut Department of Correction.
Right now, guys, this video of this show is brought to you by Guardian RFID. From inmate tracking and cell checks to cloud-based business and artificial intelligence, Guardian RFID digitally transforms jails, prisons, and juvenile detention facilities of every size. Visit guardianrfid.com for more information. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show Tier Talks to you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to my other sponsor, American Military University. And we come back, let's talk about breaking up inmates' fights. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it. It's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
All right, and we're back. Russ, going to ask you first. I'm sure you've broken up a few fights, correct?
Absolutely. It's one of those things where the danger is always present. And it's especially elevated, though, in a fight situation. You never know exactly what that fight might be about. It might be something just two guys. It might be a gang incident. It might be a setup to hit staff. So you always have to exercise extreme caution.
Yeah, remember, guys, James Vaughn, that's how it started. It was a fight, but it was a decoy. And they wind up taking the facility hostage, and we lost a hero that day. Hey, Doc, I'm sure you broke up a few fights in your time, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Over the course of my career, more than I can remember. And, to Russ's point, I agree with all of that. As many times as you do it, none of them are the same. There's always something that's a little bit different. I always thought one of the most important aspects of situational awareness. A lot of officers will run full force into the situation. That's all well and good, but you want to get a visual of what's going on around you before you completely engage the subjects.
All right, Russ, I'm going to ask you this first. So I posted this question on Facebook. It was, the question is, hey, let's give out some tips, because originally the message came through Facebook. And I thought we'd wind up doing a quick video. But when I saw the comments, I was like, wow, this is a pretty interesting discussion. And to realize how many people were actually interested and providing these tips. There were no jokes in this discussion like usual. I mean, this was straight up to the point. And during the dialogue, I did notice that a lot of people talked about their response. So now, again, if you have two inmates fighting, are we running to that code?
Well, what I would say is that what you're trying to do is you're trying to provide the appropriate response, the appropriate level of response. Sometimes running to that code is necessary. You don't want to do things, in your ingress to that situation, though, that's going to make it worse. You want to do the smart things. You want to make sure that you're, first of all, that you're not going to tear up a knee or ankle on the way there. You're going to make sure that you check, your hard 90s, because you don't want it to be a setup or something like that. And second of all, you want to cool your jets a little bit right before you get there, so you have a second to familiarize yourself with what that situation is, that situational awareness as to where other inmates might be stationed, as to where they might have placed weapons or something like that, if indeed it is an attempt to hit staff or something like that. You want a moment to be able to take that into account, and maybe to get some more help there, maybe to call for some additional resources, or maybe even just to give that situational awareness over the radio, so that other staff, as they come in, maybe they have to pick something up on the way, handcuffs or whatever. Maybe they just need to know where they should ingress or egress from in that particular scenario.
Right. And I also want to mention too, like I'm just partnering with what Russ said, is that also the amount of energy that you have. I mean, I know a lot of officers, when they first start this business, they want to be the first on the code, as if they're racing against the other officers, and they go 100% out to whatever that location is. And then the problem is, when they get there, they have no energy and they wind up being a liability. All of a sudden they get to the unit and now they're hunched over and they can't breathe. So again, I love what Russ said. It's also about that energy as well. I mean, you got to make sure that when you get to that area that is requiring your assistance, that you're not a liability, that you also have the energy to go ahead and do what needs to be done. Because there's some facilities that are outside, and you wind up having to run a good up and down some hills to get to a unit. And if you're not in the best of shape, you're going to feel it the moment you enter that unit, and now you have to wrestle with a few inmates. But what's your thoughts on responding to a code, Doc?
Oh, I absolutely agree with everything that you said, and they're all valid points. And like you said, I think a lot of it also comes with time on the job. I think the difference would be, an older officer might be a little, the situational awareness you spoke about, that's going to be there. What I found is the same thing you said. A lot of the younger officers, you'd be running down the hall, they would be sprinting by you. And then they got down there, and as you said, they were doubled over useless. So, again, all of them good points. Conserving your energy to get down there, assessing the situation. Also, one of the other ones is, depending on what type of code it is, safety and security, making sure that your area is secure before you leave to go take off, to respond to the code. Because that, your point about maybe it was a setup. Well, it may be a setup in one area, but it also may be a setup in the area that you were leaving. So if you're an officer and you fail to secure your area or secure your inmates, that could pose a lot of problems as well. So it's maintaining your composure, because the reality, I'm sure you'll both agree with this. To this day, if I'm out somewhere at a store and I hear over the intercom, all available staff, please report, immediately it just conjures up those feelings. So if in my situation, if it was a staff related altercation, that changes a little bit. But again, you still have to maintain your composure. You still have to be aware of your surroundings. You have to make sure you perform your duties as you were trained.
Yeah, and I love what Dr. J just said, because I'm sure Russ could definitely touch on this. Let's say you have two inmates fighting in a pod, or in a dorm, maybe even in a cell, and we'll get to the specifics of each. But with that said, if you respond with all your resources, so now you're kind of losing the control you have in these other areas. And like you said, the fight could be a distraction for the area that the code is happening in, or it could be something to motivate a response. So it could be a distraction, so somewhere else could wind up emptying out. So Russ, what's your thoughts on that distraction that Dr. J mentioned as well?
Yeah, that distraction always has to be addressed in your pre-planning, right? So the pre-planning that goes into this, of course, is just exactly who is going to respond. So you should automatically know whatever position, whatever post that you're filling, whether or not you go outside of your area, whether you go to a completely other area. And that's just based on whatever the level of code that's called. And kind of have to be general here, because different places, run things a little bit differently depending on where they are. But you should always know that ahead of time, whether or not you're supposed to go. And then, after that point, people that are left behind, they might have to be the ones that start doing things like walking inmates away if the thing on the other end that's being responded to is scaled up or whatever. And so, you have to have that controlled approach to getting those inmates back to where they're supposed to be. Also, just wanted to touch on real quick, because I've seen places that do not necessarily have the best response policies in place. One of the response policies that we always had in place is that once this other place calls for the code, every other place goes down automatically. And so inmates, they're sitting on their ass. And if they're up and they're not getting down like they're supposed to, guess what? They're involved, whether they're fighting or not. They're involved at that point. And so we know that we have a further problem on the way. And so if your institution or facility or department isn't doing that, I mean, that's a big red flag for me, because that means that these other inmates are in a position where they can station themselves to do something else easily. We don't want that. We want to take them out of the equation as early as possible. And if they come back into the equation, we want to know that as early as possible as well.
Yeah, and by the way, guys, that lockdown or partial lockdown during a code, again, even if it's for a fight, is also to make sure that, if we need those extra resources, they're going to be available. So it's good to have those inmates secured. So in case we're calling people, like all staff, then we know, okay, well, at least we have these inmates secured, less likely for something to happen while they're secured. So again, that effort is to really maintain some level of control. So again, definitely with those fights, you do want to have some partial lockdown or some lockdown. And I love what Russ said. If the inmates are not, here's another thing, guys. Sometimes when two inmates are fighting, and let's say one inmate starts to get the best of him, but the other inmates don't like that inmate, they're going to make it harder for that officer to control the unit, because they want that inmate to get their ass kicked. So that's why, sometimes we may have to go in, because now it's going to become a preservation of life for that inmate who seems to be getting assaulted. And now you have these other inmates that are just not listening to the directives. So the officer can, either get the inmates down, get the area secured, so the response team can come in and be effective. But have you ever seen that, Doc, where the inmates are kind of just not listening to the directives because maybe they don't like the inmate being assaulted?
Absolutely. And again, I think a lot of it has to do on the location of the incident. I believe that generally speaking, the larger the area you have to contain, the more problems you're going to have. In my view, a cell fight was always one of the easiest, because at least it was contained in that cell. To your point, you have something jumps off in a block, you could have a lot of potential issues. Also, I think, whatever type of block, is it a dorm versus a celled unit? Celled units were a little bit easier, I think, to control, because if you have 100 inmates out, in my experience, something jumps off, once the officers start yelling, you may get 20, 25% that will lock themselves automatically. A few will kind of straggle out and then lock up on their own, but it's easier to eventually contain that area. Whereas in a dorm, you have individuals on their bed, much easier to jump on and off. So I think, obviously one of the biggest issues is trying to keep it from spreading, contain, the situation. But absolutely, I mean, you're going to have, in almost every situation, you have at least a handful of inmates that are going to be very interested and possibly become violent themselves.
Right. And guys, there's a lot of facilities right now that don't offer officers OC, and OC is a great de-escalation when it comes to us managing a fight, whether it's two inmates fighting in a cell. Well, while I'm waiting for the team to respond, I could spray a little something in the food port. If the inmates are not listening to my orders, hey, stop fighting. No, you're not listening. I'll spray a little something inside the food port, to see if I can get you guys to maybe slow it down. Or same thing in the pod or the open dorm. If two inmates are fighting and I happen to be right where it's happening, I may spray them to move myself away. I'm not going to get involved. I'm going to try not to get involved, because again, this is a dangerous situation for me to get involved without backup. But if I do have the OC, I could make the effort to tell them, without putting my hands on them, hey guys, stop fighting. Oh, and then just spray them orange, if you will. But Russ, what's your thoughts on carrying the OC, especially using it during these times?
Okay, well, yeah, that actually kind of leads into several different things. First of all, in your response in making your way to this, you're absolutely no good if you don't make it all the way there. So I would say, don't be running full out, keep yourself controlled, because, a rolled ankle, a busted up knee, something like that not only takes you out of the game, but it takes additional staff, additional medical, and we don't want to deplete resources in that way. As you're getting closer to the fight, of course, you want to have your tools in your hands and ready to go. And by that, I mean, OC, maybe your baton as well, because, as you come into these situations, especially when you're crossing thresholds where you have hard 90s to either side of you, you want to be able to bring those things into play, because you don't know if it's a setup. Just because you're responding to something that's, a couple of units away doesn't mean that there might not be a setup waiting for you along the way. So you want to be able to deploy that OC, and having it already holstered is not going to cut it for you as you're crossing one of those thresholds, whether it be through a housing unit, or whether it be, going from a yard onto a unit or what have you. So yeah, you should always make sure that you're ready to go, even if you're nowhere near the incident yet.
Right. I want you guys also to, I don't know if we mentioned this at the very beginning, but the officer that's, let's say, working the unit, that sees the fight happening right in front of them, and I'm not talking about in a cell where it's contained, but maybe in the dorm or in the pod, I got to reiterate this. It's not, you don't want to respond to that. I mean, you're going to call the code. If you can get some OC off at a safe distance, you could give the orders, but maybe at this point, what you're going to try to do is get to a safe area if that's possible, because you don't know if it's a setup. But if it's not possible to get to a safe area, you could try to maintain control of the rest of the unit, so the response team can come in and have limited amount of obstacles. But one of the first things, my advice, if there's a fight happening and you're calling the code, my thing for you is that if you are able to get the OC off, that's great. That's the initial thing. If you can get that off, definitely get that off. But some facilities don't even offer the officer's OC, which to me is ridiculous. But I don't really want you putting your hands on these inmates. As Russ said and Dr. J said, that could be a situation where they want you to come in, and next thing you know, now the response team, which was preparing to respond to a fight, is now responding to a hostage situation. So if you could retreat to a safe area, that's even better. And if you can't do that, again, you want to control the unit, get the inmates where they need to be, so you can go ahead and have that response team come in with limited amount of obstacles. But what's your thoughts on that response, Doc?
Oh, I agree completely. To the example, if you're the officer in the block, that's, something jumps off, first thing you do obviously is call it in. And then, you just monitor the situation, wait till you get the staff assistance. Absolutely. Like I said, you yell out to, the population. In my situation was always a cell block. And you, like I said, I would get a good chunk of inmates that would lock up at that time. And then you just, as you said, you continue to monitor. You maybe move inmates away from the door area, so as staff respond, they're able to come in, and just make sure that you're aware of everything going on, the individuals who are involved, if anybody else is jumping in, if there's maybe any weapons. So then as people are coming in, you can let them know what's going on.
Go ahead, Russ. I know you got a thought.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to talking about the situation here, if you're able to deploy that OC and that takes everything down, that's great. And I don't want anyone to get the idea that I'm telling you not to go hands-on if that's what you need to do. But OC is seen, even by the inmates, to some degree as a lower level of force. If you get into a situation where you have to deck an inmate or you have to take him down hard, his homies that are right there and haven't got involved yet, because it started out as a fight between, two inmates and stuff, they're much more likely to get up off the ground and rush you. And I've been in situations like that. So, stay with that OC, as long as you can. Next, go to your baton if you have to. If you have to go hands-on, that's fine. I'm not telling you not to do any of those things. What I am telling you is be cognizant of where you're at and who else is watching and why they're watching you, because there's nothing really to stop them from getting involved if they decide to at that moment in time. So just know that you don't want to be the trigger for that if you can help it.
Yeah, guys, especially if there's a gang hit on somebody, now you become the obstacle to stop that hit. So now I could picture those inmates going against you. So whatever could be done could be carried out, because if not, then they could be targets of a hit. But I like what Russ is saying, because in my mind, again, if I have, let's say, two inmates fighting in an open area, I'm also trying to create distance between myself and them. I am giving the directives, maybe spray a little something if they're not listening, but I'm going to do my best to not put my hands on them until the backup team comes in, because I don't want to put myself into a position where now I'm vulnerable, and now the team that's got to come in to protect me now has a whole, other obstacle to deal with. Because even when there's a fight happening in that unit between the two inmates, I know that some of us, we're responding to stop that fight. I get that. But some of us are making sure that officer's good too. We're going to make sure the officer's not caught up in the mix, or, that, in an effort to try to stop them fight, because sometimes the officer may find themselves right in the middle, that, we're able to get to them and pull them out safely. So, to help out that response team, you try not to put yourself in a situation that makes you vulnerable, because then the response team is going to have to be the one to also put themselves in a vulnerable situation to get to you. What's your thoughts on that, Doc?
Oh, again, I absolutely agree with that. I think it's important to have an idea of what's going on around you. I think another point also would be depending on the actual shift, depending if the situation jumped off on first, second, or third shift. I started my career on third, and I know that at our facility, we had maybe 5 or 6 responding officers. So if there was a situation, you called a code and you had 5 officers show up, that's all you're getting. So, obviously day shift, you have the most amount of response, second, third. So I think that's also something that needs to go into the equation as well. How, at what point would you normally wait for more staff to respond until you realize that this is all you're getting?
Right. And also as a supervisor, I'm kind of backtracking a little bit. Russ was mentioned this before, and I wanted to touch on it again, was with the resources. As a supervisor, if you feel that there's enough people on the scene, then you should make that directive to get everybody else kind of, as backup, because again, you still have the rest of the facility. You don't want all your resources going out to that one area, and now you have, 20 or 30 people in this one area, leaving all the other areas unsupervised. So as a supervisor, I believe at one point you may be the one said, okay, guys, the code's good. We got enough people here. Let's start getting this side of the facility back to where it needs to be. Right, Russ, as a supervisor, do you do that?
You do, but you really have to be, watchful as to the totality of the circumstances and the totality of the scenario. Because, just because you believe what happened, just because it appears that this is, your run-of-the-mill fight or something, it may not be. So you do want to start releasing resources, when you can, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you're not getting ahead of yourself and that you're not biting into a setup from the inmates. So I think that's a good point. But you always have to, keep in the front of your mind that you may not have been presented yet with every bit of information that's out there, because it has yet to be discovered.
Yes, I agree. So I'm hoping when that decision is made, obviously the unit has some level of control, and hopefully the two fighters, whoever the fighters are, have been secured. Obviously, if there is no level of control, you do want to have enough staff to maintain that control. But there is that boundary too, because you don't want to lose control by having too many staff. So that can happen both ways too. I know a lot of people think, yeah, let's get out there in numbers, let's do what we got to do. But sometimes you have, the more numbers that are there, sometimes you can lose a bit of the control. So I think there is a fine balance. But I know you want to say something, Doc. What's your thoughts?
Oh, no, I was agreeing with that. And, again, to the point of just being in our situation, normally it was a lieutenant. Whenever the lieutenant responded to the code, the lieutenant was the individual to clear it, notify main control. And at that point, you may have some officers kind of go out in the hallway or the concourse, wherever it was, and slow other officers up from just charging down like that. Oftentimes, a lot of codes or a lot of fights are broken up really quick. I mean, you may call a code, you have enough officers in that area to control it, and it's taken care of. So, the idea of staff management obviously is huge throughout the facility. And to your point earlier, if you can read it through a little bit, make sure that the situation doesn't need the immediate response. But to Russ's point, you want to make sure that obviously later you're going to have investigations to kind of see where, what the results were.
Yeah. And I also, I think it's just good to get the information out there, because I've been in situations where, I was the manpower supervisor and I would count like the first 5. And then once the first 5 went in, I would stand and let the other 5 know, hold back. And the reason why you do that is, God forbid, the first team runs in and the area is compromised. At least I have a backup team, and hopefully they're able to take over what needs to be done. But if I lose all 10 at once into a compromised area, or whatever the numbers may be, whatever the response is, depending on the facility, because obviously you have 2 inmates fighting, you probably should get 10, 5 and 5. But either way, you definitely want to just make sure that when it comes to that level of control, it's not only about control in that area that's affected by the code, but it's also about controlling the rest of the facility. Because God forbid I lose all 10 during that code. Do I have enough people now to take care of the rest of the facility if needed? So it's a very fine line. Hey, Russ, has there ever been a situation where you think that having too much staff respond to a code could be a concern?
Yeah, if just mostly like what we talked about before, if you pulled them too far off, from their other areas of responsibility, or if you're flooding that line in a way that they could become compromised if it really is a setup. So these are the things that you really earn your pay as a supervisor when you're doing this stuff, because you have to take into consideration in a very quick manner all of these things as they're occurring. And then, sometimes as they're starting to get maybe into that one building or something, you realize that it really is going to crap, and you need to, flood it with more. And so, you send more on there. And I've been there, done that. It's not easy, it's really, quite amazing when you start thinking about, all the resources that you have at your disposal, all the resources that you're having to manage at that point in time. And, it can become a very daunting task.
And you notice, like, even though we're talking about just inmate fights, I mean, obviously everything has an inherent risk. Even 2 inmates fighting in a cell, even though it's contained, I mean, trying to take 2 inmates out that are still being non-compliant after they've been sprayed, to try to get 10 people in the cell to pull those 2 inmates out. The injuries that you're going to get, but I will tell you one thing, though. When 2 inmates are fighting in a cell and you kind of hear the ruckus, because you'll hear it. When 2 inmates are fighting in a cell, it echoes. Even if, here's the funny thing, guys. Even if the unit is noisy for you at the podium, an inmate or somebody's going to hear it, and it's going to bring your attention to it, because either they tell you or everybody starts to look towards that affected area. So the next thing you know, the officer walks over there, gives the order, hey guys, stop fighting. They don't listen. They spray the, they call the code. They spray the inmates inside the food port, obviously secure the food port, but then they can lock down the unit. The inmates are fighting in their cells, so the officer can, slowly lock down the unit, and you'll see the inmates. Most of the inmates will probably like, okay, there's a code happening. They know the response team is coming. So some of them will, if they can get back to their cell, they will. If they can't, like Russ said, they'll probably just lay on the floor because they don't want to be taken out. And then this gives the response team the immediate chance to come in, because now, mind you, it's not the pod or the unit that's affected, so they're able to go into that area. It's going to be the cell. So now they're able to get a little bit more closer to the action, bring their people up, and then do what they can to take those inmates out. And at all times, the officer that, called the code, sprayed the cell, whatever they did, locked down the unit, take note of everything. Take note of the time, the inmates involved, the response team, your actions, whatever specifics you can, because documentation matters in case this turns out to be something more than just 2 inmates fighting. Because, if one inmate gets the best of another inmate and they keep going and they're not listening to your orders, you could have a death. A fight could quickly turn into assault, which could quickly turn into a death. So taking note of everything, because you never know where this can go. If this can get to that higher level. Also, if there's crazy amounts of blood, we got a crime scene. You know, if there's crazy amount of blood, the moment we get those inmates out, we got to secure that cell for a crime scene, check for weapons, do whatever it is. So, hey, Doc. So if you're that officer calling that code, you know, let's say we'll go with the cell first. You know, what are some of the things you need to take note of? You know, because again, for your report later on.
Well, when you first witness the two individuals in the cell fighting, first thing you want to do is you want to make sure you want to look in and see if there's any. You're going to call the code first. Then you're going to, again, the situation awareness. You're going to look around. You're going to give verbal direction for the inmates to recall. You're going to monitor the fight, see if there's any weapons involved. And again, to your point, you're going to make sure you have all this information so you can document it properly. Again, you're going to await staff assistance. Take care of the situation, and as staff start to come in, just to make sure all other inmates in the unit are secured as well. Getting back to our point earlier, maybe something's going off somewhere else in the block, do a visual, and then just assist as needed.
Yeah, hey Russ, I like what Dr. J said, because if there is a weapon involved in the fight, I have seen an officer, when they call the code, announce inmates fighting, weapon involved. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, you know, there's really probably not such a thing as being okay to have too little information. That's always a good thing to know, because once weapons are involved, it changes the dynamics on number one, the level of force you can use. Number two, the number of other people that might also have weapons on the periphery that get involved. I've seen 2 weapons turn into 10 on a number of different occasions. And then you get beyond that, and there's other situational scenarios that you might want to know about. For instance, if it's not going to, cloud up the radio traffic or something, if you have sprayed, it's nice to know when I come into that unit, hey, I'm going to get a little doused, because right before I enter, I can start getting my breathing under control. Or if I have a gas mask, I can don it. Or, maybe it's time to break out some gas masks if that's the way that particular institution does it. Maybe not everyone has a gas mask. Whichever way it unfolds, it's good to know that stuff, because then we can start getting, resources to unfold. When you start talking about, hey, maybe you're making that announcement and that weapons were involved, there's a, higher degree of a chance for a serious physical injury. So maybe that starts to spool up medical on that. Maybe you're going to have your MERT team come down there to evac these guys from the yard. So all this stuff plays in. And so, there's a million different scenarios, and you have to pick the exact right number of choices to get to a successful conclusion.
Right. And you also mentioned radio traffic, guys. Obviously, during a code, radio traffic should be very limited unless emergent, but definitely some communication should be heard between the affected area. And I would go all the way as far up as the shift commander or the master control, whatever you want to call it. But at that point, all radio communications cease, except for where, the people that are dealing with that code directly, from the supervisor to the officer on scene, response team, whatever it is, because that shift commander, or that master person up there that's watching over everything, they need that information ASAP. So, and I noticed, guys, there's zero tolerance. There's zero tolerance if you're messing around with that radio during that code. It could lead to a serious charge. Would you agree with that, Doc?
100%. That's something you can't do anything to jeopardize staff safety unless you have a very specific reason for being on the radio. Do not be on the radio.
Yeah, and now also when we have the 2 inmates that are kind of battling it out in the cell, once the team comes, and let's say the inmates are not compliant, they're still fighting and they've been sprayed. What's the next step for the suited teams, the supervisor, Russ? What are we going to do next? We have 2 non-compliant inmates in the cell. Officer has deployed OC. Inmates are still fighting. Possible weapon. What do we got next?
It's going to depend largely on what the specific agency's use of force says about entering that cell. Usually what you're going to see is you're going to see, a 2-team situation. Hopefully you're going to have enough shields there. Hopefully you're going to have enough batons there and stuff that you're going to be able to make entry. And this is going to be, a complete, hands-on use of force scenario. And it's just going to be a matter of literally doing it by brawn and by baton for the most part. There may be some agencies that, might want to deploy some type of other chemical munition in there or sting balls. It just kind of depends. Like I say, different agencies have some different resources, some different products that they may try and use. For the most part, OC or other chemical agents seem to get pretty good results. There may be times where you might have to have a direct impact firearm, like a 40 millimeter launcher. Those are always handy. I've seen those used. So it depends on that policy. It depends on that procedure. It depends on the level of training that the people that are there to handle it have.
Yeah, and part of the comments that were posted up, I think this is more coming from the old school officers, but maybe some of the new school, is if you have two inmates that are evenly matched, and one's not really getting the best of the other, they're just kind of going at it. People even said, hey, let them tire themselves out like a hockey referee. And then once you get in there to break it up, both of them don't have the energy to fight somebody else. So I'm going to I want to get both your thoughts on this, because there were some people that were pushing for the emergency and you got to get in there quick. But I respect the fact that I just highlighted there's no weapon and you just have two inmates that are evenly matched and they're just battling it out, just tiring each other out. So what's your thoughts? Do you let them tire themselves out, Doc?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. Again, I think a lot of this has to do with generational. So I started in 93. Things were a little bit different. My first training officer, I think, started in 77 or 78. So the view on those sorts of activities was a little bit different. There was a particular situation, as you said it. I recall getting ready to run to a situation. He kind of grabbed me and pulled me back. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, "Hey, rookie, just hang out for a minute." And they did. They banged it out a little bit. It was straight up. There was no weapons. And when they got done, it was done. So I'm not saying it didn't happen. I can't say if the system is particularly better than the other. For me personally, if that was the case, I never really had an issue with it.
What about you, Russ? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it really all comes down to two things. And one, that's appropriate action and justification, right? So you do have to take action. I mean, that's what we get as officers. That's what we get paid to do. All right. So you go in there, you've done your spray part. It's turning out to be ineffective or not effective enough. And so at that point, you're left with a little bit of a conundrum. Can I let them stew in that for a little while longer? And can I justify that action? You bet I can justify that action. So I continue to give them commands to stop, because that's also action. That's appropriate action. That's what we should be telling them. And we're also looking to make sure that, there may be a time that comes in that where they're finally ready to comply. Maybe you add some more chemicals. Maybe you get ready for, to take that further action of busting that cell. But you also do want to take into account what's going to happen if I open that cell. And the chances of staff getting hurt are probably extremely high at that point. So yeah, it all comes down to what you can justify versus the risks versus the rewards. But most of all, being able to justify it by saying, yes, I did take action. I waited longer because I thought that we were going to be able to resolve this in a level and manner that was lower than having to go in there with batons and fists and feet and that kind of thing.
Right now, guys, once you're able to secure the inmates, that are fighting, it's good to get your people to ask what the fighting was over. And that's also good to be documented. Again, it could be a gang thing, or it could be just something between these two inmates. But I know a lot of people, they get so, into dealing with the fight, and they got the inmates, they're bringing the inmates to be decontaminated, whatever it is. And then when they write their reports, or when they send the information up, the higher levels, when they look at the reports, and everything, I'm sure in this case is kosher, but when they look at the reports, one of the things they're going to ask is, why were these inmates fighting? And then you wind up having to go back when that could usually be asked for at that moment. And some inmates will reply at that moment. But sometimes if you wait too long and they start going through that hearing process, a lot of them are like, nah, We weren't fighting. We were horseplaying. You know, they're going to do whatever they can to, one, not snitch. But second thing is to not get in trouble through court lines. All of a sudden, a fight that was obvious in the moment, that may be the best time to see what information you need, to just kind of say, okay, hey guys, looks like these were fighting. It was gang related. And we have something here that we got to worry about. Or these are just two knuckleheads that were fighting because the one inmate snores every night and they just couldn't deal with it. Or, lately, the funny thing is, guys, this happens a lot too. When you have two inmates fighting, now the inmates will try to use PREA as an excuse. Oh, I was fighting because the inmate tried to touch me when I was sleeping. And again, they're trying to get out of the charge. And I'm not saying it's not true. I mean, you still have to investigate every allegation, but 99% of the time, the person's making the allegation to get themselves out of trouble. Hey, Doc, what's your thoughts about asking the inmates what happened in the moment, or should we wait? What's your thoughts?
My view was always ask them, once you get them back into SEG, when you're walking them down the hall, where the case may be, a lot of times, again, depending on the rapport, if you know them, if you don't, or they'll just be yelling for the sake of yelling, kind of posturing. But I think it's obviously important to get the information as quickly as possible. If they volunteer it, fantastic. If not, maybe there's an officer or something that we heard some talk about, something going off. I may reach up to security division, see if they had any information on these guys or anything about it. Or in my experience, a lot of times it was just, ask a CI. It was, I think it was, obviously it's imperative to get the information as quick as possible. I would say off the top of my head, the majority of fights, about 95%, you knew within the first 10, 15 minutes what it was about.
Yeah, Russ, what's your thoughts on that? Obviously the information is needed, correct?
You always want to ask. It may not be necessary because you might know who these guys are, what their affiliations are, what's been going on the yard. Obviously, though, before we just pick that yard back up and decide that we're going to go on our merry way as normal, that we get some kind of clue in as to what occurred. If we don't know, if we can't establish it, then we're going to want to be much more controlled about the way we bring it up. We might have to do a yard recall. So it's kind of just dependent on that. If you've got good staff, they should already be ahead of the curve, though, and really kind of know what's going on, be able to clue you in, and you ought to be able to, take that information and decide what you should do. If you don't know, if you don't have a clue, if it's not something you can substantiate, better recall that unit, get everything locked down until we can, go through all the numbers and figure out exactly what did occur. Because just because it's between two guys doesn't mean that it's going to stay between two guys.
Right. I also think, now this is a little bit subsequent to the fight, but we could just add it as well. Now, we know, obviously, if you're spraying, inmates got to be decontaminated. You also, obviously, regardless, they got to go to medical to be evaluated. One of the things I'm a big fan of, guys, and I know it's probably not done at a lot of facilities, and I don't know why, but we should be taking pictures of these inmates after these fights, because one thing is that, you want to document the injuries as best as possible. You have the nurse documentation, but you also want to have the pictures of it. But also, again, in case it travels up, you never know. An inmate could it's a fight, yes, but the inmate could get beaten up so bad that there could be injuries from it that could occur later on. Or, the inmate could take a headshot and maybe you think he's okay at the moment. All of a sudden he's bleeding inwards, So we definitely need to take pictures. And we did mention the crime scene already, if need be, but we need to take pictures after any fight or assault, because again, it's needed for proper documentation. And sometimes people wait for that to be ordered when I think that should be automatic. They had this fight, let's get the pictures done, let's take it. And those pictures should be taken as soon as possible. It should be taken before placement into SEG. I'm thinking the moment you get them into the infirmary or the hospital. And by the way, guys, we're going to control this movement, which means that you take one inmate at a time. You don't take both. You don't want both in there at the hospital. You don't want any of that. You want the first one, who's the most serious, to go first. And then once it's cleared, the supervisor can talk to the other supervisor, say, hey, I'm good. I'm on my way to SEG. I'm out of the infirmary, and now you get the other one there. And by the way, if the fight is really that bad, you may want to issue from the administrative level a keep separate between the two inmates. Therefore, it lessens the chance of them having at it again. And also, those inmates are going to have to write little documentation themselves, but one is going to be if they're in fear for their safety. And the reason why you want to have them fill out that paperwork is because, again, maybe they're not telling me what it is, but it could be a gang thing. So now, if you don't want to put it on paper that you don't need help, I'm going to utilize that to cover myself. So later on, if God forbid something happens to that inmate, hey, wait a second, they were interviewed in private. They weren't interviewed in front of anybody. It was done in private, and they refused our effort to help. They chose that they are not in fear of their safety, and at this point, they do not want any forms of protective custody. So remember, guys, there's a lot of stuff to be done after an inmate fight, which includes another thing, let's add, reviews of use of force. The officer, even though the two inmates are fighting, the officer that used the spray, that's going to be against non-compliant inmates. There's going to have to be a use of force review on that. Now, people are like, well, what about the ones that put handcuffs on the inmates? If the inmates are compliant, that's not really a use of force. The use of force is when the inmates are non-compliant. So when the officer sprays, that's going to be a use of force review. But hey, what's your thoughts on, Doc, what's your thoughts on what's needed after the fight, the reports, the pictures, the documentation, the use of force reviews?
Well, I can speak to our policy was, as you said, after the inmates were separated, they were handcuffed, they were escorted out of the unit, wherever they were at, to be brought down to medical. And we would actually, we always did photographs going back to Polaroids. I still found some old Polaroids going through my stuff the other day, and they were from, so we've always documented that. Obviously, if there was any chemical agent, they needed decontamination. If they're cleared by medical, they were placed in restrictive housing. We didn't really do, we just basically put a general kind of keep away from, at least until it got to the unit manager, so there could be an investigation as to what it was, or they were in restrictive housing. As you said, ask them if there was any issues with PREA, if there was any issues with punitive segregation, that they fear for their safety, as you mentioned. And then again, it gets back to the staff. Make sure that everybody involved writes the report, the incident report's completed, everything's documented. If it was a crime scene, when the crime scene was cleared, did the state police come in? What was the situation? But just make sure that all of those things are completed thoroughly and precisely.
Good, Russ. I know you want to add on to this as well.
Yeah, different departments and stuff are going to have their own particular view on what should be documented. But you know what? If you've already gone ahead and you already have that use of force, you're going to have to probably have some type of incident package anyway. So there's no reason at that point to not go ahead and do photographs, because it's going to end up as part of the package, and whoever does them is just going to have to append them with regards to what the rest of their report is. Now, as for the system that I was in, the poor officers that were there doing the handcuffing, resisted or not, because it's already an incident, they're going to end up having to write anyway, even though they just said, hey, I responded to the incident. I didn't see anybody use force. The inmates were already on the ground. I placed my inmate Smith in cuffs and escorted him for medical clearance. And then I made sure that I told staff that he had OC on him and he was given a chance to decontaminate. Ooh, that's the end of it. They're still caught up in it. So, there's no reason at that point not to do any documentation. And it's always better to be ahead of it than to get behind it where you're not going to be able to stop it. God forbid some guy, has a little knot on his head and it develops into a hematoma that kills him in his brain or something. So always document, there's no reason not to go through with that. A lot of places now with the ubiquitousness of all these electronic devices. We talked about your sponsor, Guardian RFID. Now, one of the things that they have is a tablet that has a camera in it that you can just, swipe the inmate's bracelet and take pictures to your delight, whether it's of a crime scene or whether it's of injuries or whatever. And so that stuff now is making it really easy to do reports. Back in my day, sometimes I still have some out there, some drawings of crime scenes, rather than pictures and good measurements and stuff. So do it. You know, there's no reason not to.
Yeah, Russ, I believe, started in 1989.
Yes, I did.
Wow. Hey, also, besides, there's going to be requests for video. Obviously, we know that. I don't know who has the authority to pull the videos. Usually the shift commander or the internal affairs division, whatever it is. I mean, that you're going to need to get those videos because, again, not only are you reviewing if the fight was open, you're definitely reviewing the fight. It could anytime be requested. But also management is going to review the response to make sure that everything is kosher and that there wasn't excessive uses of force. And again, usually these videos and the reports will all be reviewed by executive staff, and they'll sign off if everything looks good. And if there is concerns, then they will address those concerns as needed, depending on what those concerns are. But other than that, guys, I think basically here is that we want to make people know that even if it's an inmate fight, you know, don't go running haphazardly to that. You know, it could be anything, you know, the decoy, the distraction, you know, so you do want to have a controlled effort. And at all times, in order for you to be effective, you do have to make sure that you have control of the environment. For the one with the officer dealing with two inmates fighting in a cell, again, you know, you get that coat off, you spray the inmates. I mean, you have time to control the unit, you know, because the inmates are secured. It's tougher when it's out in an open area where, you know, it's harder to control. You know, the inmates are fighting right in front of you, and there's going to be an impulse for you to get in the middle. You need to not feel that impulse. You need to kind of back away. You know, if you need be, spray. But again, the last thing you want to do is to act on that impulse. And now both those inmates that were fighting both turn on you. You know, and now the response team coming in is going to be stopped before going in because they have a hostage situation, and now your life is on the line, even if they enter. And it has happened, guys. Again, Lieutenant Floyd, the hero that passed in Delaware, you know, it started with a fight and it was a setup, you know, and at that point, the person trying to do the right thing, you know, and unfortunately they got caught in what was a fight became a hostage situation. Hey, Doc, you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
Just to sum up everything we said, I think it's important for all staff to make sure that they know their post orders, they know their responsibilities. If something jumps off, maintain that situational awareness, interject when it's appropriate, and make sure you're cognizant of everything going on so you can document everything properly and get through the shift as safe as possible.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Hey, Russ, anything you'd like to say in closing?
Yeah, I just want to add here at the end, anytime you're involved in whatever it is, whatever kind of scenario, whatever kind of use of force, whatever kind of an alarm is going on, it's really important that we have follow through, right? And that we follow through all the way on everything that's happened. And by that, I mean, when we get to the end of this thing, it's not a matter of just, hey, calling it quits. We know what happened. We can go back to normal. It was a false alarm or whatever. We don't know the totality of what other circumstances might have happened out there. So we want to make sure that all of our staff have checked in, you know, in order on the radio and stuff, make sure that everyone is ready and that everyone agrees that it's time to return to normal and that we can come off of that code that we've called in a safe manner. Because I don't want to leave someone stranded out there. Maybe someone had to go over and get an inmate's ID because he wasn't getting down fast enough. And now he's become a problem, right? Because all this other stuff was going on, or I don't want to turn out that I had some staff member who's now missing and I can't find him. And that doesn't come to my attention until 30 minutes after this thing is over. No, we want to start fresh again. We want to make sure that we account for everyone. We want to make sure that everyone's area is clear and that we come off of that code in an orderly fashion. So just remember that follow through is the most important thing, and don't ever get complacent about this stuff. Develop good habits and they will serve you well.
I love that. And guys, my last piece of advice, and we kind of talked about it, is at any moment, these fights could get brought to the highest level of the court system. So you could work at a facility that's very active, a lot of fights all the time, but don't get complacent in those reports because you never know which fight could make it to the highest level of the court system. And then they start questioning you about your actions. And most of the time, these things get brought up to the court. You get questioned 5 years later. And if your reports are not as specific as possible, you're not going to remember what happened 5 years ago. A lot of us, we lean on those reports, you know, and it's like, hey, I'll read right off my report. But when you have a report that's very vague, oh man, it's just, remember, these things will also serve to help you later on. So the more specific you are, that's going to help you when all of a sudden you think you're about ready to retire and there's that, you know, court case coming your way from an inmate that you haven't dealt with in like 5 to 7 years, whatever the statute may be. And all of a sudden, you got to lean on those reports that you wrote from 5 to 7 years ago, and you're going to hope that that report was well written. Trust and believe, I see it happen a lot. As always, guys, the show is tipped. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.